An episode in international relations concluded without fanfare. No press conferences, no ceremonial handshakes, no triumphant declarations from either Washington or Ottawa. Yet for those monitoring institutional behavior rather than headline narratives, something significant became apparent. Canada achieved a rare outcome in contemporary geopolitics by quietly bringing closure to a sustained pressure campaign that many assumed would inevitably succeed. On the surface, events appeared unremarkable. Trade negotiations continued, regulatory discussions proceeded through established channels, and diplomatic communications maintained their carefully neutral tone. But beneath this procedural calm, a fundamental shift had occurred. One party maintained its escalatory rhetoric, while the other simply ceased responding to it. In the dynamics of coercive diplomacy, this typically marks the moment when leverage evaporates. The Trump administration's approach to international relations operates on a premise. Pressure functions as an infinitely renewable resource. Terrors can be increased incrementally. Threats can be reiterated with greater intensity, and diplomatic engagements can be strategically delayed. Within this framework, allied nations should respond as markets do, eventually capitulating under sustained economic and political stress. However, this analysis contains a fundamental flaw. Nation-states are not markets, and governmental institutions do not register pain according to the same patterns that political intuition might predict. Canada recognized this asymmetry earlier than Washington's policymakers realized, and built its response accordingly. The miscalculation. For months, the prevailing assumption within Trump-aligned policy circles followed a straightforward logic. Canada required market access more desperately than it valued policy autonomy. The country's export dependence, its deeply integrated supply chains, and its structural reliance on American markets appear to constitute critical vulnerabilities. Apply sufficient pressure, the reasoning went, and Ottawa would inevitably return to the negotiating table seeking more favorable terms. This logic was not inherently irrational. It simply proved incomplete. What ultimately terminated the pressure campaign was not a single dramatic decision, but rather an accumulated pattern of institutional responses. Canadian government ministries fundamentally reframed their approach, ceasing to treat disputes as negotiations requiring victory and instead addressing them as external conditions to be absorbed and managed. Regulatory approval timelines were methodically extended. Economic diversification strategies that had existed primarily as contingency plans received accelerated implementation. Coordination with other middle power nations intensified through existing multilateral frameworks. None of these adaptations were announced as acts of defiance or resistance. Instead, they were presented through bureaucratic channels as routine governance adjustments. This approach exploits a critical weakness inherent to pressure-based strategies, their fundamental dependence on visible reactions. Such tactics require counterthreats, public complaints, or diplomatic appeals to confirm that coercive force is producing the intended effect. When these confirming signals disappear entirely, escalation transforms from calculated strategy into guesswork. Additional threats can be issued, but their impact becomes impossible to assess reliably. Trump's political brand relies heavily on demonstrations of visible submission. Successful negotiations are supposed to conclude with photogenic handshakes and public acknowledgments of American strength. When no such visible outcomes materialize, the supporting narrative loses momentum and coherence. The pattern of institutional resistance. Canada did not achieve victory in any conventional dramatic sense. Rather, the country simply declined to participate in the confrontation as Washington had designed it. This distinction carries profound implications because pressure campaigns are institutional instruments, not merely personal contests of will. They require sustained bureaucratic implementation, disciplined coalition management, and predictable escalation sequences that all parties understand. Once a target state successfully navigates around pressure through legal mechanisms, economic adjustments, and administrative procedures, the campaign becomes increasingly expensive to sustain and progressively more difficult to justify within the initiating government's own bureaucratic structures. At this juncture, even political leadership strongly inclined toward confrontation faces diminishing returns on continued investment in the strategy. The quiet, procedural conclusion to this episode provides the most revealing evidence. If pressure mechanisms were still functioning effectively, Announcements would follow. If leverage remained substantially intact, new deadlines would be established. Instead, what emerged was procedural language accompanied by the gradual normalization of a recalibrated status quo. This does not constitute retreat in rhetorical terms, but unquestionably represents resolution in structural ones. Canada did not challenge the fundamental premise of American power or question Washington's global influence. Instead, it challenged the practical utility of this particular application of that power. This distinction matters considerably in alliance diplomacy. Allied nations do not need to humiliate the United States to protect their core interests. They merely need to render specific pressure tactics operationally inefficient. This episode appears relatively minor when assessed through the lens of public speeches and diplomatic statements. It appears far more significant when evaluated through the framework of institutional behavior and long-term strategic adaptation. A campaign explicitly designed to force policy movement concluded because its target developed and implemented effective methods for enduring pressure without experiencing policy paralysis. In international relations, strategic patience is not a passive stance. It frequently represents the most active and effective form of resistance available to smaller powers facing asymmetric pressure. This reality contains an unsettling implication for proponents of coercive diplomacy. Nothing visibly fractured, nothing loudly collapsed, yet the campaign definitively ended nonetheless. Institutional memory and strategic design. To comprehend why events unfolded through this particular trajectory, analysis must move beyond individual personalities and examine institutional memory. Canada's response was not improvised or reactive. It followed well-established patterns that Ottawa has refined across decades of managing relationships characterized by profound power asymmetry. Canada exists as a middle power permanently situated adjacent to a superpower, and its survival strategy has never involved matching American force projection capabilities. Instead, Canadian statecraft focuses on managing exposure to potential coercion while maintaining sufficient policy autonomy to serve national interests. The Canadian state apparatus is fundamentally constructed for endurance rather than confrontation. The country's trade bureaucracy, regulatory agencies, and diplomatic corps are specifically designed to slow and diffuse external shocks rather than absorbing their full impact simultaneously. This institutional architecture matters because pressure campaigns achieve optimal effectiveness against systems requiring rapid relief from acute pain. Canada's governmental system is deliberately optimized for strategic delay and gradual adjustment. Washington's pressure approach assumed immediacy would force rapid decisions. Tariffs, renegotiation threats, and public signaling function as instruments meant to compress decision-making timelines. They are designed to force political leadership into rapid binary choices between accepting economic damage or making policy concessions. However, Canada's institutional configuration diffuses potential pain across multiple sectors, provincial jurisdictions, and extended time frames. By the time pressure registers clearly enough to demand response, the specific demands attached to that pressure frequently lose urgency or relevance. This outcome is not accidental. Canada's federal structure, its provincial trade authorities, and its regulatory culture create friction and delay by institutional design. When pressure tightens in one policy channel, alternative channels provide relief. When one economic sector experiences heightened exposure, other sectors maintain cushioning capacity. The result is a political economy that rarely produces the acute crisis conditions upon which successful pressure campaigns fundamentally depend. Historical context and learned behavior. There exists a deeper historical dimension that Washington frequently underestimates in its dealings with Ottawa. Canada has experienced repeated cycles of American assertiveness across decades, from persistent softwood lumber disputes to complex energy politics to border security intensification following September 11th. Each episode reinforced identical strategic lessons. Never personalize conflicts with the United States, and never treat American pressure as exceptional circumstances requiring emergency responses. Instead, treat pressure as environmental weather, predictable, manageable, and ultimately survivable through proper preparation. This mindset shapes institutional behavior in fundamental ways. Rather than escalating disputes rhetorically or politically, Canadian officials consistently proceduralize conflicts. They redirect disputes into arbitration frameworks, multilateral forums, compliance review processes, and technical committees. This approach accomplishes two strategic objectives simultaneously. First, it strips urgency from the conflict itself, preventing crisis atmospheres from developing. Second, it distributes responsibility across multiple actors and institutions so that no single political figure feels cornered into making unilateral concessions under pressure. The Trump approach to international pressure operates through a contrasting logic. Leverage accumulates through repetition and escalation. State demands more loudly, repeat them more frequently, and attach additional consequences. This methodology can prove effective against political systems where centralized leadership tightly controls policy outcomes. It functions far less effectively against governmental systems where outcomes emerge from layered processes involving multiple actors with shared but distributed authority. Another critical institutional mismatch proved consequential: the question of audience. Pressure campaigns are never solely about the target nation. They simultaneously function as signals of strength directed toward domestic political supporters. Trump's distinctive political style depends fundamentally on visible dominance. Clear victories, public acknowledgments, and symbolic moments that can be packaged for media consumption. Canada's strategic response deliberately denied this audience feedback mechanism. There were no dramatic refusals to amplify through media coverage, no confrontational speeches to excerpt and broadcast, no obvious villain for narratives to crystallize around. From Ottawa's institutional perspective, this approach represented prudent risk management. From Washington's perspective, it created an informational void that made calibration increasingly difficult. Without visible reactions to measure, fundamental questions became unanswerable. Were the pressure measures producing intended effects? Were they being systematically ignored? Had Canadian institutions already priced them into existing calculations? Pressure divorced from observable feedback becomes indistinguishable from background noise. Alliance networks and strategic optionality. The alliance context provides additional explanatory power. Canada operates within dense institutional networks: NATO, the G7, multilateral trade regimes, and various bilateral partnerships. This network embeddedness grants strategic optionality. Canada does not need to counter American pressure through direct confrontation if it can incrementally reroute economic activity and diplomatic energy toward alternative partnerships and frameworks. These adjustments are not dramatic pivots that announce themselves through press releases. They manifest as marginal shifts in trade flows, regulatory harmonization with alternative partners, and diplomatic coordination that accumulate significance gradually over time. The collective impact becomes substantial even though no single adjustment appears transformative in isolation. The critical analytical mistake involved assuming that geographic proximity necessarily equals dependency. In reality, deep economic integration cuts in multiple directions simultaneously. Integrated supply chains, regulatory harmonization, and cross-border capital flows mean that economic pressure inevitably leaks and creates unintended costs for the initiating party. The more profoundly integrated two economies become, the more difficult isolating pain on one side becomes in practice. This dynamic explains why the pressure campaign did not collapse suddenly through dramatic failure. Instead, it gradually thinned out and lost sharpness. Institutions on the Canadian side behaved precisely as they were structurally designed to behave: slowly, procedurally, and with stubborn non-reactivity. Understanding this institutional context transforms what might otherwise appear as a puzzling outcome into something approaching predictability. Every pressure campaign ultimately fails at an identical inflection point. When an initiating party confuses possession of leverage with inevitability of desired outcomes, this conceptual error shaped the entire trajectory of Washington's approach, and it proved fundamentally mistaken. The leverage illusion. The miscalculation centered not on whether Canada would resist loudly and dramatically, but rather on the assumption that Canada would eventually exhaust alternatives and face no choice except compliance. This assumption shaped everything that followed, and its inaccuracy proved fatal to the campaign's effectiveness. Within Trump-aligned policymaking circles, leverage is frequently conceptualized as a blunt instrument. If one tariff level fails to produce desired concessions, implement a higher tariff. If one threat is ignored, escalate the threatening language. This logic assumes a linear, proportional relationship between pressure applied and concessions extracted. Such assumptions function adequately in purely transactional settings. They break down completely in institutional environments. Canada never operated under a binary framework, presenting only two options: immediate submission or economic collapse. Instead, Canadian policymakers operated within a far more nuanced calculus of adaptation. This distinction appears subtle in abstract analysis, but proves fatal to pressure strategies in practice. Adaptation cannot be coerced through the same mechanisms that might force surrender. The belief that Canada would inevitably fold relied on a familiar narrative in international relations. Economic asymmetry guarantees political compliance. The United States constitutes the overwhelmingly dominant market. Canada maintains deep integration with American economic systems. Therefore, pressure will inflict damage on Ottawa faster and more severely than on Washington. On paper, particularly when reduced to trade statistics, this argument appears persuasive. In operational practice, however, this analysis ignores how costs distribute politically across different governmental systems. Economic pain does not translate into political pressure equally across institutional structures. In the United States, tariffs create highly visible domestic constituencies, affected industries, workers, and regions that complain loudly and mobilize politically at early stages. In Canada, costs tend to diffuse through institutions structured to absorb blame collectively rather than concentrate on individual political leaders. This structural difference means Canadian political leadership faces less concentrated backlash and consequently possesses greater capacity to wait out pressure campaigns. Trump's team also systematically misinterpreted silence as weakness. When Canadian officials reduced public responsiveness, the operating assumption held that pressure was functioning effectively behind closed doors, forcing quiet concessions. In reality, the opposite dynamic was occurring. The absence of public reaction signaled that internally, the issue had been administratively downgraded from crisis status to manageable ongoing problem. Time horizons and precedent. A fundamental misjudgment involved time horizons and precedent setting. Pressure campaigns implicitly assume target states value short-term economic relief more highly than long-term policy autonomy. Canada deliberately inverted this assumption. Short-term economic discomfort was consciously tolerated to avoid establishing a precedent of compliance under coercive threat. This choice reflected institutional calculation rather than ideological commitment. Once that threshold was successfully crossed, once the system demonstrated it could absorb sustained pressure without capitulating, the campaign lost its strategic foundation. Additional threats can be issued, but the fundamental lesson cannot be unlearned. The system survived the pressure and adapted. The first successful act of institutional endurance proves most important because it establishes proof of concept for future resistance. Another significant error involved assuming that personalization would enhance pressure effectiveness. Trump's distinctive political style relies on directness, publicly naming leaders, framing disputes as personal contests of will between individuals. This approach functions effectively when the opposing party internalizes the contest as personal. Canada's institutional response refused this framing entirely. Disputes were systematically characterized as technical issues, legal interpretations, or procedural matters requiring expert resolution. Personal pressure directed at individual leaders had no effective landing point within this framework. This created profound strategic asymmetry. One party was engaged in a visibility-focused game, while the other operated within a process-focused framework. Visibility as a political asset decays rapidly without continuous reinforcement. Process-based approaches compound their effects slowly but cumulatively. The miscalculation extended beyond Canada specifically. It reflected a broader misunderstanding of how contemporary allied states defend themselves against coercion in the modern international system. They do not attempt to match coercive force directly. Instead, they dilute it through institutional processes, reroute it through alternative channels, and strategically wait for its intensity to diminish. By the time clarity emerged that no decisive concession would materialize, available escalation options had already become constrained. Additional pressure would have generated higher domestic political costs within the United States, while producing diminishing returns internationally. At this juncture, the campaign ceased functioning as leverage and transformed into potential liability. What renders this episode particularly instructive is the minimal drama accompanying the failure. No diplomatic breakdown occurred, no public reversal was announced, merely a gradual erosion of relevance. This pattern characterizes how most coercive strategies ultimately conclude. Not through dramatic defeat, but through quiet exhaustion as institutional attention shifts elsewhere. The adjustment phase. Once the fundamental miscalculation became operationally apparent, the narrative center of gravity shifted from initial intent to subsequent adjustment. This transition highlights why institutions matter more than individual leaders in sustained geopolitical interactions. Canada did not announce a strategic pivot through press conferences or policy speeches. Instead, adjustment was implemented quietly, methodically, and without framing it as a response to Washington at all. The initial signals were bureaucratic rather than political in nature. Files that had previously been treated as requiring urgent resolution were administratively reclassified as ongoing matters. Expected timelines for various processes were extended. Interdepartmental coordination intensified across multiple policy domains. What external observers might interpret as bureaucratic inertia was internally a deliberate redistribution of governmental attention and resources. Pressure mechanisms only function effectively when they monopolize policy focus and force target governments to prioritize pressure-related issues above other concerns. Canada's institutional response deliberately denied pressure this privileged status within policy hierarchies. Regulatory agencies began exploiting existing flexibility embedded within their mandates and procedures. Standards enforcement decelerated in some domains while intensifying in others. Compliance frameworks underwent comprehensive review processes, not to provoke confrontation, but to identify and reduce exposure to external pressure. Critically, none of these adjustments violated existing international agreements. They simply exploited discretionary space that already existed within those frameworks' implementation structures. This represents a form of state power that most pressure campaigns fail to anticipate, the power of selective interpretation and flexible implementation within rule-based systems. Trade ministries simultaneously accelerated economic diversification strategies that had existed primarily as contingency plans shelved during periods of stable relations. New memoranda of understanding were signed with alternative trading partners. Pilot programs received expanded scope and funding, and diplomatic engagement deepened with countries offering market alternatives. These initiatives remain incremental and can be defended publicly as prudent long-term planning rather than reactive countermeasures. The strategic objective was never to replace the American market overnight, an impossible and economically irrational goal. Instead, the purpose was to signal internally to Canadian businesses, investors, and political stakeholders that market dependence could be actively managed rather than passively feared. Diplomatically, Canada recalibrated tone while maintaining substantive positions. Public messaging emphasized predictability, rules-based order, and policy continuity. This communication strategy served purposes beyond managing Washington's perceptions. It was strategically aimed at international investors, potential partner nations, and domestic stakeholders. In an increasingly volatile global environment, predictability itself functions as a valuable strategic asset, and Canada deliberately leaned into this comparative advantage. What did not happen? Perhaps most significantly, understanding this episode requires noting what conspicuously did not occur. There were no retaliatory spectacles, no symbolic countermeasures designed primarily to generate headlines and domestic political support. Such actions would have confirmed the continued relevance and effectiveness of the pressure campaign by demonstrating it was producing strong reactions. Instead, Canada's institutional response treated the situation as administrative friction, unpleasant but manageable within normal operational parameters. This framing created a profound dilemma for American policymakers. Pressure without visible reaction forces a binary strategic choice: escalate further despite rising costs and uncertain benefits, or move attention to other priorities. Escalation carried increasingly substantial costs and progressively more uncertain payoff as Canadian adaptation continued. Moving on to other issues meant tacitly accepting that this particular tactic had exhausted its utility. Governmental institutions, facing finite attention resources and multiplying crisis demands, typically prefer the latter option. This preference explains the origin of quiet endings in international disputes. They emerge not from explicit concession by either party, but from institutional reprioritization. The disputed issue ceases commanding senior-level meetings, drops down priority lists in briefing books, and transitions from something political principals actively fight over to something administrative staff manage routinely. This may not constitute formal resolution, but it represents functional conclusion. The adjustment phase also revealed asymmetry in institutional discipline and comfort with ambiguity. Canada's governmental system operates comfortably within ambiguous situations. It can sustain unresolved disputes indefinitely without generating internal pressure for dramatic resolution. The Trump-style approach, by contrast, exhibits strong preference for narrative closure. Clear wins, acknowledged losses, and public announcements that resolve ambiguity. When such closure fails to materialize, political momentum dissipates. By the time Washington's pressure apparatus fully recognized that Canada had effectively normalized the situation as routine rather than crisis, the leverage window had closed. Disputes can be reopened and threats can be reissued, but the initial shock value cannot be recreated. Institutional systems adapt to new environments faster than strategies can recalibrate. This outcome was not dramatic victory for Canada in any traditional sense. It represented something potentially more durable: successful absorption of sustained coercion without fundamentally altering core policy behavior. This defines what resilient systems accomplish. They do not defeat pressure through direct confrontation. They render pressure strategically irrelevant through adaptation. Second-order effects. The most consequential outcomes of this episode did not materialize at the point where pressure was applied. Instead, they emerged elsewhere, indirectly, gradually, and across extended time horizons. This pattern reflects how power typically moves through international systems once direct coercion fails. Power does not disappear. It changes channels and alters subsequent calculations. For Canada, the primary second-order effect was enhanced institutional confidence. This does not manifest as bravado, triumphalism, or public celebration. Such displays would be uncharacteristic of Canadian diplomatic culture. Rather, it represents empirically grounded confidence that the governmental system can absorb sustained pressure from its largest and most powerful partner without triggering either crisis conditions or policy capitulation. This lesson, validated through actual experience rather than theoretical modeling, will shape future negotiations even when never explicitly referenced in diplomatic communications. Future Canadian negotiators will approach discussions with the United States carrying internalized knowledge that their institutional system survived this test. For the United States, consequences prove more subtle and considerably less comfortable. Pressure campaigns are supposed to clarify and reinforce hierarchical relationships within alliance structures. This particular campaign blurred that hierarchy, not because American power declined in absolute terms overnight, but because its application in this context produced no clearly visible results. In international politics, this ambiguity creates uncertainty not primarily for adversaries, but for allies. Allied nations continuously observe how pressure is deployed not only against themselves, but against other similarly positioned states. Canada occupies a distinctive category in American foreign policy: geographically close, economically integrated, politically friendly, and structurally dependent in specific domains. If sustained pressure fails to decisively move a state fitting this profile, it raises uncomfortable questions about tactic effectiveness against other similarly positioned allies. This matters quietly but profoundly in subsequent alliance management decisions. Alliances function on assumptions about predictability and effectiveness. When those assumptions erode, alliance behavior adjusts incrementally. Institutional memory and tool selection. An additional effect manifested within institutions responsible for policy execution. Bureaucracies develop organizational memory, regarding which policy tools produce desired outcomes, and which tools become administratively expensive without delivering proportional results. Over time, instruments falling into the second category see reduced utilization regardless of which political figures occupy senior leadership positions. This does not mean coercive tools disappear entirely from a foreign policy toolkit. It means their deployment becomes more selective, more cautious, and less automatic as default responses. This represents loss of momentum rather than formal authority. However, in practical statecraft, momentum frequently determines whether formal authority translates into concrete results. Canada's successful adaptation also produced unintended but significant long-term benefits for Canadian policy autonomy. By accelerating economic diversification initiatives and normalizing procedural management of disputes with Washington, Ottawa reduced future sensitivity to similar tactical approaches. Pressure campaigns rely substantially on novelty and surprise. Once a governmental system treats them as routine challenges requiring standard administrative responses, their coercive edge dulls rapidly. There emerged no clear winners in any celebratory sense. Canada did not gain meaningful leverage over Washington. The United States did not collapse into international irrelevance. What changed was a gradient of influence, the ease with which pressure flows in one direction and produces intended outcomes. Pressure ceased flowing smoothly from Washington to Ottawa as easily as it had before. This represents the critical significance of the adaptation process. Washington adapted through disengagement without formal acknowledgement, a response that is not surrender in traditional terms, but represents strategic fatigue. When the cost of continuing a campaign exceeds the cost of allowing an issue to fade from priority attention, institutions predictably choose silence over escalation. The broader consequence involves quiet recalibration of expectations within foreign policy establishments. Pressure can no longer be assumed to work automatically against close partners with institutional depth. It must now justify itself through demonstrated effectiveness. That requirement alone changes behavior. Policy strategies requiring explicit justification tend to be employed more sparingly than strategies assumed to be automatically effective. The narrative dimension. A narrative consequence also emerged. Trump-style pressure politics depends fundamentally on visible dominance to sustain domestic political energy and international reputational effects. When outcomes become ambiguous rather than clear-cut, supporting narratives weaken substantially. Ambiguity functions as poisoned performative leverage. Political rallies cannot be organized around procedural drift and administrative normalization. None of this will appear in official communiques or diplomatic statements. Its effects will manifest in how future disputes are initially framed, how quickly threats are issued, and critically, how consistently those threats are followed through with concrete action. Power rarely announces its own limitations explicitly. Instead, it reveals those limitations through altered institutional habits and modified strategic behaviors. Canada did not celebrate this outcome because functionally there was nothing appropriate to celebrate in traditional victory terms. The United States did not concede because there was nothing requiring public concession. However, both governmental systems adjusted their assumptions and behaviors. In geopolitical analysis, such adjustment frequently represents the most meaningful outcome regardless of public narrative. The broader implications. Pull analytical perspective back far enough, and this episode transcends being merely about Canada or Trump in any narrow bilateral sense. It transforms into an instructive case study in how modern power actually behaves when confronting institutional resilience rather than political theater or immediate economic vulnerability. What initially appears as a quiet non-event reveals itself upon examination as a reminder of principles that many pressure-based strategies prefer to forget. Credibility in international relations is not measured by how forcefully or loudly coercive instruments are deployed, but rather by how predictably those instruments produce desired outcomes. Noise without results diminishes credibility faster than silence. The traditional model of leverage assumed that dominance could be demonstrated and reinforced through escalation. Apply harder pressure, raise costs more dramatically, compress decision timelines more severely. This model functioned optimally in an international system where states were less networked through institutions, supply chains were less interdependent across borders, and governmental bureaucracies possessed less accumulated experience in absorbing external shocks. That international system no longer exists. Contemporary middle powers operate within dense institutional networks and have developed sophisticated techniques for managing asymmetric pressure. Canada did not defeat American power in this episode. Instead, It demonstrated something more unsettling for advocates of pressure-based diplomacy, that substantial power can be rendered operationally inefficient without being directly confronted or challenged. No dramatic speeches, no theatrical resistance, no public defiance. Simply a methodical refusal to reorganize national priorities around another state's threats. This is not defiance in traditional terms. It represents insulation, and insulation achieved through institutional design proves far more durable than resistance achieved through confrontation, credibility, and institutional response. What this episode reveals is a fundamental shift in how institutional credibility is earned and maintained in contemporary international relations. States that remain substantively calm under sustained pressure signal strength simultaneously to multiple audiences, financial markets, alliance partners, and domestic political actors. This multi-audience signaling functions far more effectively than dramatic gestures aimed at single audiences. Conversely, states that escalate rhetorically without producing proportional results signal volatility and declining effectiveness. Over extended time horizons, institutions respond to these signals accordingly. Capital gradually adjusts investment patterns. International partners incrementally hedge their dependencies, and bureaucracies internalize new assumptions about what strategies work and what strategies carry excessive risk relative to returns. This analysis does not suggest coercion has become obsolete as a tool of statecraft. Rather, it indicates that coercion has become fundamentally context-dependent in effectiveness. Coercive strategies work best against actors lacking procedural depth, alternative partnership networks, or political patience to outlast pressure campaigns. They function poorly against governmental systems specifically designed to outlast headlines and absorb shocks across extended time frames. Canada belongs firmly and deliberately in the latter category. The Trump approach to international relations exposed a deeper tension in modern governance structures, the widening gap between performative power and administrative power. Performative power requires visibility to function. It needs reactions from targets. It needs moments that can be framed as victories. It needs content that plays effectively to domestic political audiences. Administrative power, by contrast, thrives on routine operations, policy continuity, and deliberately low drama. When these two forms of power collide directly, administrative power typically prevails, not quickly in ways that generate headlines, but reliably across time horizons that matter for institutional behavior. Alliance management. An additional lesson concerns alliance management in asymmetric power relationships. Allied states do not expect perfect agreement or permanent absence of friction with more powerful partners. However, they do expect reasonable predictability in how power is exercised. When pressure tactics become the default instrument rather than the selective exception, Allied states begin optimizing their institutional structures against those tactics. This optimization process unfolds slowly, quietly, and proves extremely difficult to reverse once embedded in institutional practices. The quiet conclusion of this particular pressure campaign is not a failure that any party will explicitly acknowledge. There was no formal reversal because none was operationally required. Policy attention shifted to other priorities, governmental institutions reprioritized accordingly, and the file effectively closed without ceremonial conclusion. This pattern reflects how influence frequently erodes in international relations, not through dramatic collapse or public humiliation, but through gradual habituation and declining salience. What remains following this episode is a measurably recalibrated landscape. Canada will approach future disputes with the United States carrying greater confidence in its institutional capacity to absorb stress without capitulating. Washington's foreign policy institutions will exercise greater caution before assuming that geographic proximity and economic integration automatically guarantee policy compliance. Neither government will frame this episode as a definitive turning point in bilateral relations. Yet both will behave in subsequent interactions as if it were precisely that. Behavior reveals true assessment more reliably than rhetoric. The evolution of power. In the final analysis, this episode illuminates less about one political leader's tactical preferences and far more about the evolving mechanics of power in densely institutionalized international systems. In a world thoroughly networked through multilateral institutions, integrated supply chains, and complex regulatory frameworks, Traditional leverage expires faster than strategic patience can be exhausted. Political noise fades while institutional systems endure, and sometimes the most consequential endings in international relations are precisely those that occur quietly while observers elsewhere continue waiting for confrontations that never materialize. The mechanisms of power are changing beneath the surface of public diplomacy. Coercion retains utility but has become selective rather than universal in application. Institutional resilience has emerged as a practical counter-strategy available even to middle powers. And patience, properly institutionalized within governmental structures, has proven itself as an active form of power rather than passive acceptance. The lesson extends beyond this specific bilateral relationship. For any state contemplating pressure campaigns against institutionally sophisticated partners, the Canadian case offers a cautionary example. Assume nothing about inevitability. Respect institutional depth, and recognize that silence can indicate strength rather than weakness. For states potentially facing such pressure, the lesson differs but proves equally valuable. Institutional design matters enormously. Procedural capacity provides strategic options, and sometimes the most effective response to pressure is not dramatic resistance but patient absorption. The quiet ending stands as testament to these principles. Nothing shattered, nothing loudly collapsed, yet something definitively concluded. That conclusion will shape future interactions in ways that speeches and threats never could. In the evolving landscape of international relations, this represents how power actually moves, not through headlines, but through the accumulated weight of institutional behavior over time.